Okay. Yes. So hello, everyone. Should I just say next for the next slide or? Okay. Yes. Okay. Okay. So my name is Kim Schumacher. I'm an associate professor at Kyushu University in sustainable finance and ESG. Before that, I was a lecturer at the Tokyo Institute of Technology, and before that, a postdoc at the University of Oxford, all in sustainable finance. But my background is actually law and environmental science. So today I will talk about greenwashing. And why is greenwashing important? Because as we see in Japan, a lot of people wear the SDG pin. So there's a lot of talk about SDGs and sustainability, but working with large investment firms and looking at ESG data, I also found that there's a lot of talk and sometimes a little bit less action. So, but that is very important from a financial point of view to evaluate risk. And that is why I want to talk about greenwashing and also about something called competence greenwashing. And I will explain a little bit later more what that is. Next slide, please. So these are just a few slides about greenwashing. So greenwashing is generally becoming a major issue in the ESG and sustainability field. And in a lot of areas, different governments are now taking action. So this is just as an introduction to frame greenwashing a little bit. The next slide, please. So no more greenwash. So we also see, for example, in the EU, people are becoming aware, and greenwashing is basically everyone now tries to promote environment, sustainability, SDGs, and it's more like talking and very little action. And people become aware because we talk a lot about reducing, for example, carbon emissions, but everywhere, every year, even in developed countries like OECD countries, the emissions still go up. And that is a problem. So we try to do the right thing. We talk about the right thing, but are we doing the right thing? That is a different question. Next slide, please. So now we see tackling greenwashing and promoting transparency. And that is not only in Europe. Recently, that has also been the case in Japan, that the government is becoming aware that it is great to have a nice sustainability report. It is great to have a lot of nice pictures that have trees and that have the sky and that have a lot of nature-related pictures. But it is also about the action. Are we actually having an impact? And that is where my research also comes into play, because I look at the data and I try to look at what a company says, and then also try to look at the actual data. And I don't rely only on what the company tells me. I also rely on satellites, on other different data to find out what is the difference between what is being said and what is actually being done. So next slide, please. And here we see, this is actually a very important slide, because it shows that greenwashing is basically the disconnect between what companies or anyone says, claims, and also the expectations that are being raised. For example, if I say I have this wonderful technology that can reduce carbon emissions, then I generate expectations. People think, wow, that is great. But if that technology is very early prototype, not even realistic, it would be extremely expensive to produce, then, and maybe only it will only be become a reality in 20 years, but I'm already promoting it right now, that then I create expectations that maybe are hard to prove that it has an impact. And then we see, for example, the ESG evidence and also the capacities. For example, if I tell you I can prepare a dinner for 500 people, and then I find out I only have 2 employees, then it's very unrealistic that I can do that. So it is also capacities. I can say I can do something, but if I don't have the skills, if I don't have the capacities, if I don't have the resources, then it is also greenwashing. If I say I can stop deforestation, but I'm not looking, I'm not measuring, then it is an empty phrase. I cannot prove that I can actually do that because I don't have the resources. So that is also very important. It's the disconnect. It is between creating expectations and making claims versus providing evidence or having the resources to do so. And that is really important. Next slide, please. So greenwashing is basically if I make any environment or sustainability related claim and I don't provide evidence. I don't have any data to as proof. That is, it can either be a product or a service. So that is very important to bear in mind. So if I make any form of claim, people will think, oh, that is great. That product is environmentally friendly. It protects the environment. It's good for sustainability. But if I don't have any evidence, then in the end, it's just marketing. And that is very dangerous. Next slide, please. And then also in terms of sustainable finance, we now also see the same thing. So you have a lot of financial products, for example, a sustainability fund that says, for example, we will help reduce deforestation. But if there's no way of collecting data, then how can I prove that my fund is actually doing that? Or if I have no employee that is monitoring that, how can I do that? Or if the data that I have is incomplete. For example, I say I reduce deforestation in Southeast Asia, but I only have data, for example, for I don't know, Myanmar. Then I exclude like 6 or 7 other countries where deforestation is also happening. So am I actually being correct? If I say I reduce deforestation in Myanmar, then it's more correct than saying I reduce deforestation in Southeast Asia. So it's a lot about the wording and what I actually promote. And that is very important also for regular products, but also in the finance sector. Next slide, please. I will just keep track of the time. And this is just an official definition that I also worked on. So I'm also a member of the ISO technical expert group or technical working group. And we created a definition for greenwashing for green finance products. I will not, because in the interest of time, I will not go too much into detail, but just knowing that there's now a formal definition of greenwashing in the ISO for ISO standards, and that is ISO 14100. Next slide, please. So I wrote, this is a paper that I wrote that came out in 2020 on sustainable finance in Japan. And that is also where I started looking much closer at how well are Japanese companies actually performing and are there actually risks? Next slide, please. Because that is important because now Japanese companies are also, they have to, incentivized and expected to provide more disclosure on sustainability related metrics and indicators, especially greenhouse gases. So that is very important. So it becomes even more important what a company says and what a company does. And in terms of reporting, it is also very important to verify the data of a company because even a company reports things, someone needs to be there and verify it. It's similar to peer review. If I'm a researcher and I just publish a paper and there's no one checking it, then it is not very reliable because it's just my opinion in the end of the day. And if no one is verifying it, then in the end, it is just data that the company produced, but no one checked, no one independent checked it. And that is very important. Next slide, please. And I will not go in the interest of time, I will not go too much into the taxonomy, but just saying that now there's rules to know what is green and what is not green to provide indications and more details so that not everyone can say, oh, my activity is green or my activity is sustainable. So there's now more concrete rules and we call it a taxonomy. And that is very important so that not everyone can say, oh, what I'm doing is green or sustainable. Next slide, please. And then also next slide. Next slide. I will jump over those. Next slide, please. But it's important to say that greenwashing is now recognized as an actual risk to financial markets and to risk. Because if every company says, oh, we are doing great in terms of sustainability, but sustainability and climate change factors and environmental factors are becoming worse, someone has to be lying, because if we're all doing great, but everything gets worse, that means not everyone is doing very great. So we need to find out who is doing better than others and what is the actual data. That is very important. Next slide, please. And this is just a continuation. So Europe is becoming more active in that, very active in terms of trying to fight against greenwashing. Next slide, please. The United States is also becoming more active in terms of fighting against greenwashing. Next slide, please. That is just more about that. So the United States is also now already fining some financial institutions for misadvertising or for not reporting certain ESG data. Next slide, please. And why is that even relevant? Because sustainable finance has been growing very quickly and very exponentially in recent years. It's becoming very attractive. So, and whenever something becomes attractive and customers or clients are interested in it, you get a lot of attention, but you also attract people who just want to benefit of it. And that is an important part. And that is why greenwashing is such a large part of sustainable finance right now, because there are a lot of products in the market that are claiming that, making a lot of promises in terms of sustainability or the environment, but we do not really know if they are having any actual impact. Next slide, please. And this is just some of these funds, like, we do not really know what is actually in them or if they're actually supporting sustainability. Next slide. And that is important because, for example, the asset management arm of Deutsche Bank was found out that they don't have, I talked about resources and capacities. They were found out that they don't have the capacities to actually manage all these funds. And they don't have the expertise to properly look at. Not every finance person is a biodiversity expert, but if you create a biodiversity fund and promise that you promote biodiversity, you need at least have some experts who know about biodiversity, because it's not enough to have watched a nature documentary and be considered a biodiversity expert. Next slide. This is just more of the same. So like greenwashing claims against Deutsche Bank. Next slide, please. I will go over those in the interest of time. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. There's a lot of slides that I will go over. Next slide, please. Because, so I wrote an article in the Financial Times where I said Japan needs to do more to do against greenwashing. And Japan is doing already more, because the regulator, for example, now provides a lot of guidelines. But one of the important differences between the EU and Japan is that in Japan, a lot of it is voluntary. So companies don't need to do it. Whereas in the EU, recently, companies need to be more transparent, need to provide more ESG data. And that is one of the things that is extremely important, because voluntary is sometimes not really working. And it has made that Japanese companies have become less attractive for international investors. And that cannot be good for Japan either. Because again, it's not enough to constantly say we support the SDGs, have everyone wear the SDG pin, and then at the end of the day, your companies are still having a negative impact in terms of environment. And that is very important, because ultimately it also makes sustainability funds less credible, and that is an important part. Next slide, please. So here was even a New York Times story about the SDG pin in Japan and how it is everywhere in Japan. So even the New York Times has been covering that, there's a lot of talk about the SDGs, but much less measurement of the SDGs. Next slide. And here you see even Toyota CEO or ex-CEO, Toyoda Akio-san, wearing it. So it is so present in Japan, and it can even be considered a form of greenwashing, because you create expectations. When you see this pin, you think people know about sustainability. People care about sustainability. I think if you ask some people on the train who have the SDG pin, please tell me 5 SDGs. I wonder how many can tell you 5 SDGs. I would be really surprised. So it is more about appearance. And I'm not saying, no, you know, like 17, but I'm just saying that even me, I don't know all 17 by heart, but I'm just saying it is more about appearance. And sometimes when it becomes about real transparency, it's much harder to get good data. But for me, also someone who invests in sustainability funds myself, I would like to know all the data because I want to know what company is doing better than another company so that I can use my money and put it where I want to. Next slide, please. And Japan is now cracking down on greenwashing. And so in the terms is also becoming much more aware of what needs to be done. The next slide can be skipped. Skip, please. So I wrote about competence greenwashing, and I will just, if everyone is okay, go 4 minutes because it's very important, I think, for everyone, is competence greenwashing. I wrote this article in 2020. So competence greenwashing is, and I see that in Europe just as much as in Japan, is, so I come from I initially did law. I studied Horitsu. And then I switched over into environmental science. And it took me 10 months of intensive study, or maybe less intensive sometimes. But I had to do an entrance exam to do environmental science at Todai. And somewhat I passed. I was not, I don't consider myself like particularly smart, not particularly atamagai, but I passed anyway. And I was passionate about sustainability and environment. And recently, everyone needs to promote sustainability. Also, employees. Companies say, we want sustainability experts. We want ESG professionals. So as a worker, I also want to show that I have knowledge about sustainability or ESG. And that doesn't happen overnight. And so in terms of doing that, there's a lot of like certificate programs recently, and where you can, over the course of a weekend, you can learn about sustainability, and then you can call yourself a sustainability expert afterwards. But it doesn't work that way. If I watch 5 videos of YouTube about medicine, I don't become a medical expert. I am not a doctor afterwards. And the same is for climate change or for biodiversity. You don't become a biodiversity expert just by knowing a little bit about nature. But in the finance sector, I have been working with some large banks. I have been observing that trend where a lot of people suddenly, they just get a new title. If you were an equity analyst before, now you're an ESG analyst. If you were head of CSR before, now you're head of ESG. It's just renaming old job titles to look more sustainable. So the company can say, we have tons of sustainability experts in our company. We are so ready. And that is not how it works. It takes time, but also you need to integrate actual experts. And the finance sector is not very good at that. They don't know what to do with a physicist. They don't know what to do with a climate scientist because it is very hard, but that is what needs to happen. Next slide, please. I will go over those slides, but happy to share them with anyone. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. So here's what is said. Like, yeah, there's a lot of demand for people, sustainable investing, ESG specialists. So next slide, please. But in Asia and in Japan, there's not enough supply of those experts. Next slide, please. Next slide. So competence greenwashing, what is it? Next slide, please. I wrote this paper and it has had a lot of impact, and it actually has been referenced, as I will show, by certain regulators in the UK, in Singapore. Next slide, please. It's about describing what competence greenwashing is. And I explained it a little bit right now. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. And I created this chart, and that is what created a lot of discussion. So what I said is, you need to have a skill that is material. What do I mean by that? So for example, the example that I always give is, if you're on the plane and someone gets sick and the flight attendant asks, is there a doctor on the plane? And someone raises their hand and says, I'm a doctor in history. That is technically true, but it's not very relevant. Yes. So you should be a doctor in medicine. And that is what this graph basically describes. And I have been told that my time is at the end. So I hope that please do reach out afterwards. But this graph and the paper that I just showed are very relevant. But I explained a little bit the concept of competence greenwashing. We should also be honest about our sustainability skills. And it's not enough to watch like a few videos about sustainability and then be called a sustainability expert. That is very important. And companies should not just add job titles like ESG or sustainability in front of existing job titles to make themselves look more green. That was the basic purpose. Thank you very much. I will end. So if you want the slides or so, I think they might be shared or so. Yes, then please do reach out or talk to me after this. Thank you very much. Sorry for the time is over.